Hey guys, okay, last video is going to be thinking about characters in 2-point perspective. So you guys can see here, I have got my horizon line with some vanishing points, 2 points, and I've got my character drawn here with his eyes on the horizon line. Now, I can go in and add in my set of vanishing lines that are running off of the top of his head. Oops. Running off the top of his head and running off his heels here, just like we did in 1-point perspective. I've also drawn my box in the middle to get the midline, just like we did in 1-point perspective. But unlike 1-point perspective, you can see that this character is turned, essentially where the corner, his corner, quote unquote, would be coming kind of, down through the side of his face, down across the front of his shoulder, and kind of, down the side of his leg, like this. Humans obviously are not cubes, so he doesn't really have a corner. But you can see how he kind of lines up inside this box. One of the ways to notice this best is right here on the shoulder. You will notice that this shoulder basically forms like the top of a cube. Your collarbone would form kind of the top of a cube. Same thing with your waist. But of course your waist is round. It's more of an ellipse, but these two areas on a figure show, kind of how a person lines up inside our whole guide box that I've got drawn. So his perspective, taking him back towards the horizon line is going to work very similar to how it did in 1-point perspective. You are going to draw another box back here. As I said, I've got the midline, starting here. It runs back through the midline of this box all the way to the vanishing point. And here I have taken this vanishing line from this front corner and run it back to the vanishing point on the left-hand side. And then this is going to set up our grid box to draw our figure again. So you would once again pay attention to having his eyes on the horizon line, making sure that the midpoint is where the midpoint is on the key figure here, So here it would be kind of middle of his belly. And then same thing, you would want to make sure, okay, if his hands, come, just below the midline of this box here, you would make sure that, if you've got your midline drawn in on this box. Oops, let me get that. Come here, my pen is being weird this morning. Well. You would want to make sure, his hands are falling just below this midline, that his hands are below this midline. So here he is. So as you can see, I've got the midpoint of his sweater is at the same midpoint here. Hands are below this midpoint here, and his eyes are still on the horizon line. Now, the reason I focused on doing this midline first is because our character was facing this way. So I'm more concerned with getting, these figures drawn correctly as they go back towards this vanishing point. I'm going to worry less about what's on this side of the box, but that would be different if our character was facing, to the left, to the other vanishing point. In that case, I would pay more attention to what was happening on this side. And as you have seen from trying to put your characters in, different places when we did the cubes, as you get closer and closer to the vanishing point, you actually see less and less of the character. In other words, you could have a character here, and a character here, and a character here, and basically their whole side is going to be obscured because they're just standing, in a line of people, essentially. That's why you pay attention to the side. That's why I created the midpoint line on the side of the character that I was going to see the most. Okay, so that's a little bit about 2-point character perspective when our character has got his eyes on the horizon line, but I want to show one for you guys where it's not, and we're also, oops, I don't want to show all that guy yet. We're also going to talk about an aspect of doing characters in perspective that I think is important for y'all to be aware of. Okay, so let me get my monster lined up here. Okay. All right, we're going to turn this off, turn that off. What I've got here is a monster kind of half drawn with a horizon line. You guys can see I've got, our blue horizon line here with some vanishing points right here, right? Now, I've got my monster kind of drawn, and I got up here to do his horns coming off his head. But if I were doing this where I matched his horns up to the visible vanishing point, in other words, the vanishing point that you guys can see, the vanishing point that's inside the picture plane, which in this video is indicated with a yellow line, you guys can see that his horns would suddenly be tilted quite a bit. And I'd have to do quite a bit of adjustment to this monster. Now, I'd probably have to tilt his head over even more. I'd definitely have to, shift his eyes more. His eyes would, be way over. He just starts to look all wrong, right? If I use the vanishing point that I first created, which is inside the picture plane. So this brings me to how, when you're doing perspective, a lot of the time, your vanishing point is off of the picture plane. Meaning, if I did something like this, I zoom out a little bit, I still have my picture plane, again, indicated with the yellow lines. I still have my horizon line in the same place. But as you guys can see, I've now put the vanishing points. Oops, come here. Do it on that one. I've now put the vanishing points way out here, way to the edge. They're about, maybe 3 inches off of the picture plane. And now, when I go in to line up his horns, as you can see, I'm lining them up on this much more distant vanishing point, and the horns look more correct. I only have to do a little bit of adjustment. If we can zoom back in on him, I've only got to do a little bit of adjustment here, to make sure these horns are lined up better on his head, and that this one is, lined up in the right spot, and it looks like it matches with how I have his eyes designed. I could sit here and just double check his eyes, run this off to the vanishing point, let it straighten out. And I've got just a little bit of adjustment that I need to make right there, just to kind of get him in more correct perspective. So what does this mean for you guys? I want y'all to start thinking about the fact that as you get into doing more complex, realistic drawings, what you're going to need to do is actually plan on having, it's just going to bug me here, I'm going to finish drawing out his eyes. What you guys need to do is plan on having your vanishing points be outside your picture plane. We can talk about this more in class, but I think a good rule of thumb is to start with at least 3 inches on either side of your picture plane. So in other words, if your picture plane is 12 inches wide, then you would put your vanishing point 3 inches on one side and 3 inches on the other side, meaning that your actual plane that you're working with, your actual board that you're working with, is 18 inches wide, right? Because your 12 inches is what's going to be your picture plane. That's the final visible part. And then you're working with that vanishing point on either side at 3 inches out. Now, that's just an arbitrary number. You can actually do it less than that if you want to. You can do it longer than that if you want to. But I just kind of start that way. The other thing that you can do is not make stuff as tall. In other words, this guy is standing up pretty high above the horizon line. But if I wanted to make it where, okay, I want to keep my vanishing points, inside the horizon line or inside the picture plane just like this, well, I'm going to make him, a little bitty down here. And now it's much easier to get him in perspective anywhere I go with him, because as you can see, he's just not very tall. In effect, because he is so small, he has the linear appearance of being very far away from either one of these vanishing points. So it'd be easy to draw another one right here, and so on and so forth. Without him suddenly forcing down into perspective, which is what's going to happen with this guy. So these are just a couple of tricks to deal with the fact that, very often your vanishing point should be wider than what your piece of paper or your canvas in Photoshop or Procreate can dictate. Obviously, if you're working digitally, you can make that thing as wide as you want to, set those vanishing points way off. It's a little bit harder to do that when you're working on a piece of paper. But I want you guys to start being aware of that. So let's go back and let's show this guy as if he were as if I were building him up in perspective. Okay, so now I've got my vanishing line with my, I already had those drawn. Check that out. With my vanishing points here way over on the edge. I'm going to draw my picture plane in. Right there it is. You guys can see it. Now then, I've got my monster drawn in. We'll go ahead and do some vanishing lines and a grid for him. And as you can see, I've got, another box back here, right here. This is going to be for our monster back here behind him. And as I said, this time he's facing to the left. So I've done the grid facing to the left on this side. So, I can tell where my midpoint is here. It's just below his little chin. So this midpoint here is going to be, when I draw him into this box, his chin has got to be just above that midpoint. So then I can start to draw him in right here. But now if I want to be extra careful and make sure, I've got his nose and chin and mouth lined up exactly right, I probably need to give myself a couple more guidelines. As you guys remember from 1 point perspective, I would have y'all draw a guideline for a shoulder and a guideline for a chin. And this just kind of helped you show where your character's, different features should be. So the same thing would apply here. I'm going to give him a couple guidelines for his face. Now, as you notice, I added some guidelines. One, this is connecting here to the top of his nose. This is connecting here to the bottom of his, the little lip of his mouth right here. But as you notice, I didn't run these guidelines this way to this vanishing point, right? Because that's not going to help me out any. I ran them back through this monster back here behind him, because these guidelines are going to go through this character in perspective and show me where they should be. Let's go ahead and give him his mouth. And you guys can see, sure enough, I've got his little lip guideline going right through there. I've got his nose guideline. And this just kind of helps me out, getting him exactly, his facial features placed on him where they need to be in perspective. Okay, so that's a little bit about characters in 2 point perspective. However, I do want to make this point, and we will also talk about this in class, and that is when it comes to doing characters in 2 point perspective, It's actually much better to just have a really good handle on the figure or on your character design. And the reason for that is this. Just close all this up. I'm going to give myself another layer. The reason for that is this. If you start drawing your figure in perspective, right? Let's just think about a human for a minute as a bunch of boxes. You start drawing your figure in perspective, and then the minute they start moving, essentially what they are is a whole bunch of boxes with a whole bunch of different vanishing points in 2-point perspective, right? Remember how we can have multiple vanishing points? They're basically just going to have a bunch of vanishing points every which way, and it becomes very difficult for you, the artist, to sit here and go, okay, here's my corner, here's my corner, here's my corner. Where's my vanishing, I've got a vanishing point right here and a variable vanishing point up here, doing this, I'm doing that. And then this one, I've got a vanishing point right here and a variable vanishing point up here, and I'm doing this, and I'm doing this. And you can sit there and do that and make sure you've got your figure in perspective. But if you have a really good grasp of your character design, of the human figure, of animals, of dogs, of horses, whatever, you really only need to know a character in 2-point perspective to check that you are getting their features in the correct place as you move them around the page. Personally, I have used the concept of 2-point perspective when I'm checking hands. If I've got hands in a close-up, then I can break my hands down into boxes like this. I can break my fingers down into boxes. And then I can start kind of using the concept of 2-point perspective to check that all my fingers are going in the right direction. That all of my fingers are telescoping the way they should, and so on and so forth. But that's just me personally. That's the one time that I've used it when I've had to do, actually very definitely remember a game sequence that I animated that had hands reaching in from the foreground. And I checked that perspective over and over and over to make sure that, those fingers were coming in correctly into the foreground. For the most part, it's much better to rely on your ability to draw the character and get them correct, and then just use those kind of general midpoint guidelines to make sure, like I said, that you're getting the features correctly placed. Okay, so turn this guy's back off. I'm going to turn my monster back on. That is a little bit about characters and 2-point perspective. So I will let you guys go and see you guys in class this week.